Thank you for coming out this morning. We are excited to talk about this study of officer-involved shootings here in Anchorage. Talk a little bit about what the study is and what it is not at the beginning, and show you a few of the findings. We have a complete report. It runs about 25 pages plus appendices. That's on our website, the UAA Justice Center's website, and it'll also be on the Anchorage Police Department's website. So my name is Troy Payne. I'm an assistant professor of justice at the University of Alaska, Anchorage. And in July, the police chief called me and asked if I could take a look at officer-involved shootings over the past 20 years. This has become a controversial topic in the past handful of years, and the police department was very interested in trying to describe these incidents in a way that really hasn't been done in the past. So the purpose of the report that we're talking about today is to describe these officer-involved shootings over a 20-year period. And the difference between this and the type of news reporting that's done is that ordinarily when an officer-involved shooting occurs, there's lots of press reporting about it, but there's not a whole lot of contextualization. There's not a whole lot of how does this look in the context of other events that have occurred. So nobody has really looked at all of these events all together before, at least not here in Anchorage. The purpose today is just to describe these events. This report is not a causal study. I only looked at incidents where officers fired a weapon intentionally at a human target. I did not look at cases where officers could have but did not fire their weapons. So I can't explain to you why these events occur. I would need incidents where officers did not fire their weapons to be able to describe causal relationships. It's also important to note right here at the beginning of this that I made absolutely no determination whatsoever about whether any particular shooting was appropriate, whether it was within the law, and whether or not officers followed policy and training. So I am really looking at these as a group, as a collective, and not at any individual shooting. So if you have questions about any individual shooting, those are not for today. The data source for this project was criminal investigation files developed by the Anchorage Police Department at the time of the shooting. So we had interns from the Municipal Department of Law, legal interns, go through and code all of these criminal investigation files for a variety of situational, officer, and citizen characteristics. I then went through all of the files. I read every page of every report. I had no access to internal affairs reports. So the reports that I had were the criminal investigation files from those incidents. I did not have access to whether or not the Anchorage Police Department had determined that officers had violated policy. And I also did not conduct any independent interviews of people that were involved in the incident. So I'm really just looking at the criminal investigation files that are compiled by the police department under the oversight of the Department of Law at the time of the shooting. So we looked at situational characteristics, we looked at characteristics of officers, and we looked at the characteristics of citizens. Situational characteristics included things like the level of resistance provided by the citizen, the weapon type that was used by the citizen, time of day, day of week that the incident occurred. Officer characteristics included basic demographics, so age, race, gender, also their tenure on the police department, how long they've been employed by the Anchorage Police Department. Citizen characteristics included, again, basic demographics, age, race, gender, and also whether or not the citizens had a criminal history. And there are a variety of other things also included in the full report. So if we look at these incidents over the past 20 years, I looked at officer-involved shootings. Officer-involved shootings were defined as an incident where a sworn employee of the Anchorage Police Department intentionally discharged a firearm at a human target. So this did not include dispatches of moose, for example. It only included human targets and intentional discharges of firearms. There were 45 of these incidents from the beginning of 1993 through the 11th of May this year. The 11th of May is not some magic date. It just happens to be the date of the last shooting that had been fully investigated at the time we started data collection in July. So I wanted to make sure that I only had completely investigated incidents in this report. There are between 0 and 5 officer-involved shooting incidents per year over this time period. The greatest number of shootings occurred in 2012. It's 5 shootings, but there were 4 shootings each in the years 2000 and 2004. And so we can tell from these numbers, 5 is obviously greater than 4, but it's not by much. So to say that the Anchorage Police Department was engaged in more officer-involved shootings in 2012 than in any other year in the study is accurate, but the difference is 1 incident. In every one of these incidents, the citizen had a weapon. In every one of these incidents, the citizen had a weapon. I'll talk about weapon types here in a minute. The typical incident involves the citizen not only having a weapon, so not only possessing a weapon, but also threatening or attempting to use that weapon. So it's not just that, for example, a citizen had a handgun, but they also made an attempt to use it. They brought the weapon up to a firing position or had started to do that. The most common injuries were injuries to citizens, gunshot wounds. So on injuries, it's split almost evenly by thirds in non-fatal gunshot wounds, fatal gunshot wounds, and then bruises and lacerations. The typical incident occurred between midnight and 7 a.m. on a weekday. This is a little bit surprising. I've got more detail in a moment, but coming into this, not knowing what the data was going to look like, I would have assumed that it would be Friday and Saturday nights, and it's not what I found. The typical incident involves officers responding to a citizen call for service, and the most common type of call for service that they're responding to is a disturbance or disturbance with a weapon or an assault. Usually, these incidents do not involve a large number of people. The typical incident involves 1 citizen and just a handful of officers, 1 or 2 officers. There were only 3 incidents that involved more than 1 citizen. If we get into the details just a little bit, and we look at the types of weapons that are used by citizens, the most common type of weapon was a vehicle. And this probably requires a little bit of explanation because most of us in our daily lives, we don't think of vehicles as a weapon. We think of a vehicle as a metal box that we get into to go to work or to the coffee shop or whatever it is that we're doing. The typical incident involving a vehicle was the citizen had been eluding or trying to flee from the police. The police had managed to box in the citizen. The officers exit their patrol cars, and at that point, the officers are vulnerable because the citizen can attempt to, and in many of these cases did, attempt to play bumper cars to move the officers' vehicles out of the way and escape the police. So when you have police officers outside of their cars in a situation like this, there's a very real risk that the officer is going to get pinned between the citizen's car and the police cruisers. It creates a very dangerous situation. So this number, this 40% number for these officer-involved shootings that involved a vehicle, this number starts to explain why the Anchorage Police Department changed their policy, tactics, and training regarding vehicles and how they stopped vehicles. The next most frequently weapon used was a handgun. If we combine handguns and vehicles, it's a little bit more than 3/4 of the weapons used by citizens. Something that may require a little bit of explanation here is this simulated weapon. There was a concern on the part of the police department about things like BB guns or toy guns or airsoft guns, things that looked like firearms but were not firearms. And so this was something that we measured separately in the report, and it turns out they were used by citizens in only a handful of incidents. Citizens typically offered a relatively high level of resistance to police officers. So in nearly half of the incidents, the citizens either pointed a weapon or made some other nonverbal threat with a deadly weapon. In another 27% of incidents, the citizen either attempted to or actually succeeded in hitting someone with a vehicle. And so again, a vehicle comes up as a deadly weapon, and I know that that's hard for regular people to understand. In these three incidents here, or these three citizens, I should say, where they offered no resistance, these three citizens were passengers in vehicles where the driver was engaging in either eluding behavior or attempting to hit someone with a vehicle. So this table here shows you number of persons, number of citizens, and these three were those secondary citizens involved in these incidents that offered no resistance other than being the passenger in a vehicle where the driver was doing something very unfortunate. As I said, we'd get back to the hour of day, day of week, and here this just shows you the number of incidents that occurred by hour of day and day of week. And again, I was expecting to see Friday and Saturday nights, but that's not where these incidents tend to cluster. They tended to cluster between midnight and 7 a.m. Wednesday, Thursday, and Friday morning. It's worth mentioning here, as well as throughout the rest of the report, that we only have 45 incidents. This is very good. It's very good that we have a low number of incidents. It's good for the community. It's good for the police department. It makes data analysis somewhat difficult, however. When we start splitting out this data into subgroups, we get very, very small numbers very quickly. So it's hard to say whether or not this is a true pattern or whether it's just random chance because we have so few incidents. One of the things that we found when we started looking at the race of the citizens and the race of the officers is that minority citizens, in particular African Americans and Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders, are overrepresented in officer-involved shootings relative to their proportion in the population here in Anchorage. This is a difficult topic for everyone, and I think it's worth discussing in some detail. One of the things to know is that the most frequent racial category for citizens were whites. And so it's not that the majority of citizens involved in these incidents are minorities. That is not the case. However, African Americans here are involved disproportionately, as well as Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders. We took a look at this by decade, and we looked at, does it matter when these incidents are? And it seems to be what's happened is that in the first decade of this study, so 1993 to 2002, African Americans were overrepresented, and in the second decade, they seem to have been replaced, if you will, by Native Hawaiians and other Pacific Islanders. Over the same time period, the population of Native Hawaiians and Pacific Islanders, according to the U.S. Census Bureau, the population of that racial group here in Anchorage has doubled from just less than 1% to a little bit over 2% of the population. When we look at the race of officers as well, we have the percentage of all officers that are white. It's just about 85% as of this year. We look at the percentage of officers involved in officer-involved shootings, and white officers are underrepresented relative to their proportion of APD. So if you're starting from a position that white officers are engaging in these shootings more often, that's simply wrong. That's not the case. And what we see when we look at this is that Asian and Pacific Islander officers are overrepresented in shooting incidents relative to their proportion in the Anchorage Police Department. And African Americans are also overrepresented to a somewhat lesser extent in these officer-involved shooting incidents. We don't really know what to make of this or why these relationships exist the way that they do. We only have 45 incidents that we're talking about here, and having read all of these reports, and many of these instances, they occur too quickly for the citizen and the officer to really register the race of the other. So we have to be very careful when we're interpreting what this might mean. We just don't quite have enough data, and we don't quite have the right data to start drawing conclusions about why this occurs this way. One of the problems that some police departments have had across the country is there have been a handful of high-profile incidents where officers have fired a lot of rounds at citizens. We don't have that here in Anchorage. Nearly half of these incidents are resolved by police with 3 or fewer shots fired. So this is consistent with officer training and tactics. They're firing their weapons, they're reassessing the situation, and then they're making a determination about whether to fire additional shots. And these are all of the shots that are fired by all of the officers involved in the entire incident. So for not quite half, about 46% of them to involve 3 or fewer shots was pretty incredible to me. And this is an empirical demonstration of something that came out from having read all of the investigation files sort of over and over again, was a story of restraint by the Anchorage Police Department. That officers would arrive on the scene, you'd have a citizen that other people had called about, there was a problem, the citizen was obviously armed, and officers did not fire their weapons until that citizen started to bring a weapon up into a firing position or made some other threat with it. It's really incredible, in having gone through all of these, the degree of restraint that's used in the average incident by Anchorage police officers. When we looked at the characteristics of citizens and we started looking at the criminal history of citizens, we found that the majority of citizens, over 70% of citizens that are involved in these officer-involved shootings, have at least one prior conviction for a misdemeanor or a felony. So I excluded minor offenses and traffic tickets, that sort of thing. These are misdemeanors and felonies. So the majority of citizens had at least one conviction for a prior crime, for something not related to the officer-involved shooting incident. And 15% of these citizens had 11 or more convictions for prior crimes. Over half of the citizens had a prior conviction for a felony. So that is suggestive of who gets involved in officer-involved shootings. A lot of these citizens also had active wants or warrants. They were actively suspected of having committed a crime, usually the crime that led to other citizens calling the police in the first place. So that's what I have for you today. We have 25 pages of this report that are up on the UAA Justice Center website. It's also up at the police department's website. And I expect you to have a series of questions after you have a chance to look at that. I'm happy to answer questions now. I believe the chief is also happy to answer questions.
Thank you, Dr. Payne. I don't have a prepared statement to make. I have some notes down here in case you ask me something I got to refer to. but I'm happy to take your questions about the study.
I was just curious, your just initial thoughts on this report and just kind of, you know, what you were most interested in the findings, what you thought was maybe the most unusual or unique about it.
Sure, there's a, you know, it was a fascinating report. I mean, we all have sort of an anecdotal view of what we think is going on, but to have somebody that knows data actually crunch this stuff and give you the numbers is instructive. We knew that the kind of people we go up against when things go bad, they're bad folks doing bad things. They're armed, they're aggressive, they're violent. We know that in our guts, but to see it, the number up here, to realize that in all those shootings over 20 years, virtually everybody had a weapon, and virtually everybody did something with it to provoke the shooting. That was significant to see that rise to the top. I mean, I said 100% number. We knew we had, instinctively, we knew we had a problem with vehicles. We've been talking a lot about that. You know, we changed up our program this last late spring, early summer, as a result of some very recent shootings. And we had a spate of them in the early 2000s as well. But nobody had ever counted that before. 40% of our officer-involved shootings revolve around vehicles. I mean, that tells us that we were on the right track on that one, I think, when we made those changes. What else I learned from it is there's some things that myths that were debunked. The Friday night, Saturday night craziness leading up to shootings. That's not reflected in this data. I would not have guessed that. I don't know there's anything I can do with that information, Rick, necessarily, but it was an interesting observation. The other thing that I hadn't thought of, although it was beginning to occur to me, I already knew that I wanted to look at situations that could have gone to so far as a shooting but didn't, and compare those against shootings. I mean, something told me that would be worth looking at. That you could have a recipe for a shooting. Let's take a recipe for a shooting that should have been and wasn't, and compare the ingredients and see what the difference is. So I didn't know if Troy's study would help us figure out what would cause a shooting, and what I know now is it doesn't tell us causal. It describes shootings but doesn't give us the causes of the shootings, and that he needs that data, and then if he had that data, maybe he'd be able to do that. So. So far on that one, we had collected a handful of reports. We just sent out, during the summer, we sent out a request to all sworn people to, you know, think of a case where you almost shot somebody but you didn't, and copy it and send it to my office. So we got a stack of those. It's not enough of them, I don't think, for a researcher to do a project on. But next year, we're going to be collecting our use of force data in a better way, a more online way. And it's going to allow us to track certain kinds of force that I think will point us to those cases I'm referring to. The cases where we have our guns out, we're trying to make a high, dangerous arrest, and force could be indicated here. I mean, we're ready to use force if we need to. We can track all those cases now electronically instead of by hand. And so I think in a few years we'll have the other side of that coin to look at. And what this study told me is I need I need to learn the other side of the coin. Maybe I'll find out something. The missing ingredient is, I'm making this up, so I mean this is probably not what we find, but maybe it's the arrival of the third officer suddenly reduces the chances of this thing turning into a shooting by 46.23% or something of that nature. That's where I want to get at eventually. This is the first step, and it tells me that it's only the first step.
What's your thought on just the race specifically, and that Pacific Islanders were overrepresented, not just in victims, but in the officers involved in the shooting as well? Did you find that strange at all? Or?
It's interesting. It is interesting. I think the numbers are so small that you're talking one or two, and they change, one or two things change in 20 years, and it still adds up to a 50% increase or something. So I can tell you that in the first 10 years, there were 0 Pacific Islanders shot. So anything we do in the second 10 years is a huge increase. We have more, the population is growing, so there are more people out there that we're mixing it up with, and we have more of them on the department these days. So I don't know that it means anything. I mean, when you're talking 2s and 3s, I just don't know that it means anything. But it is interesting. The number of African Americans that we engage in and shoot at are going down first half to the second half. Pacific Islanders coming up the first half to the second half. Hispanics, natives are going down first half compared to second half. Whites are going up. It seems to me the data is all over the place, but the numbers are pretty small. The difference, you know, if you look at the before and after for African Americans, it looks like a significant difference, something like 25% or something. The difference in people is 1. There's like 4 in the first 10 years and 3 in the second. So I don't know how much you can hang your hat on these data.
I mean, that's also a good thing for the police department, though, in that you've only had 45 people shot by officers in 20 years. I mean, just talk about no officer ever wants to engage in something like this if they don't have to.
We go to 250,000 calls a year. That's the number of times officers are dispatched to go take care of a problem. I ran some numbers last night. About 40,000 of those would be what we would call high risk or dangerous calls. To give you some idea. Now, some of those calls, when you get there, they're not what they said. They turn out not to be dangerous, and there's other things that are not dangerous, and then suddenly they become so. But just as a sort of a reference point, about 40,000 times a year, you can probably figure we're going to a hot call. And to have 0 to 5 that actually involve in shooting, I think is good news. I wish we had the ability to compare to other jurisdictions. We don't have that. Some big cities have done something like this: New York, Las Vegas, Wisconsin, Madison, Wisconsin. Those I know about. There may be others. The Mid-Sized City Chiefs section of the ICP, which I'm a part, is looking at producing a standard database that the Mid-Sized City Chiefs will all do the same way, and I've offered Dr. Payne's database as a place for them to start their deliberations on that. That might be instructive. So I can't tell you if 4 or 5 is high or low for comparing to cities of our size and makeup. There are some dangers in those kind of comparisons, even if you do have the data. But no matter what those numbers are, we want to bring them down. I mean, we would like to have no shootings. I don't know that we'll ever get to a place where the police never shoot anybody in forever for 20 years. But I'd like to have lots of 0s and 1s and 2s and less of the 4s and 5s.
When you're looking at that data on race, is it going to inform how you instruct your troops? I mean, how do you use that going forward?
I'm not sure we know enough to use that. As I say, I don't know that we can define. I don't think those are statistically significant numbers. I'm not a statistician. I don't know if that's the right term. Maybe that's a better question for Dr. Payne in terms of how reliable those numbers are, or whether you can base the policy decision on them. But the thing to remember is these things happen fast, and they're confusing, and the fog of war exists. And I can tell you from my own personal experience and from my knowledge of many of these shootings, these things sometimes happen. You don't know that information. You don't know the race of the person that you're confronting. Sometimes we don't know for hours afterwards when we look at the information in their on their driver's license record or something like that. It's not a laboratory situation, and so I don't know how much you can learn, or how we can change what we instruct officers. I can't tell officers, I need you to stop shooting at Native Americans, or you got to shoot at more whites, or I mean, we don't. That's not part of our decision making. Our decision making is, are we experiencing an imminent threat of death or serious physical injury to either us or somebody other bystander? In other words, is this a deadly confrontation? And if so, our job is to make an arrest, stop the problem, and that's what leads up to a shooting. So we can work on those things. The race of the person we're shooting at is beside the point.
Well, I mean, certainly there was a dialogue with the Pacific Islander community last year about these kind of incidents, and I guess I'm wondering, not just in the moment of the shooting, but before and after, is there going to be a change in that dialogue at all because of those now?
Change in the dialogue about the shootings? I think you're seeing it right now.
I mean, directly between the APD and that community?
Oh, I think you're seeing a change in the dialogue between the community. We met with the community generally, and with, if you're referring to the Shane Tossie matter, with the Pacific Islander community 2 or 3 times in the spring. We have asked the Police Minority Task Force to conduct a review of our use of force policies, and they were joined by the ACLU and Dr. Payne in that review. That report is going to be published by the Minority Task Force later this month. You have this study, which we're making public today. I think you are seeing the police department changing in a lot of ways. The community has changed in the way that they respond to the police. You've seen that change in the sudden increase in the amount of times the end game has changed on vehicle stops. We're trying to use analysis of data and innovation to get ahead of those trends. We're now in an age, the public information age. People want to know more about what we're doing, how we think, why we do the things we do. And so you're seeing us respond with public studies like this, which have never been done before at the APD, and typically are not done by other police departments. So, you know, I think you're seeing a lot more in terms of dialogue. We didn't used to talk about this stuff very much.
Dr. Payne, can you go to that police departments don't typically do studies like this? Are these use of force studies, or what's the background there?
There is no national standard for reporting the use of force generally. Now, there are a handful of programs that are run by federal agencies that offer, you know, deaths in custody and that sort of thing, but it's very difficult to compare one city to another using any of the existing data sources. And very few police departments will commission a study like this to look at their own use of force incidents outside the context of something like a consent decree from the Department of Justice or some other sort of judicial oversight. So the types of agencies that typically do this, they tend to be larger. So agencies, as the chief had mentioned, like New York Police Department, Los Angeles, Las Vegas, Milwaukee, and a handful of other places. But mid-sized cities usually don't do this. They're usually not this introspective. So this is something that not only is important for the Anchorage Police Department and for the Anchorage community, but I think it's part of a growing trend in agencies of this size, you know, in these types of communities, of being much more open and in collecting information in a way that either the department themselves can report on, or that they can, you know, bring in academic partners like me to report on.
So were there any other mid-sized cities that you looked at or found reports? And I know, Chief, that you mentioned, you know, it's dangerous to draw comparisons, but are there others out there?
You know, I looked for this, and I had difficulty finding any that were even close to comparative to Anchorage. And there are so many things that would come into comparing one agency to another. There are large differences, sort of surprisingly, there are large differences in agency culture from one police agency in one city to another police agency in another. So that's something that can come into it. You also have, in most of the country, policing is a multi-agency sort of endeavor. And so you may have, in one geographic location, you may have a county police department, a sheriff's department, a municipal police department, and a handful of other departments all patrolling in the same sort of area that, like Anchorage. I know, it's weird. But that's the way that policing is done in the United States. And so if you're looking at a municipal department that shares policing duties with a county department, if you're not adding all of that together, then you don't get something that's comparative to Anchorage. So there's a lot of very, very technical issues that come into those sorts of comparisons. As to the base question, I wasn't able to find good comparisons. If you find one, I'd love to see it because I wasn't able to find it.
Can you talk about why it was important for you to have?
The other thing I wanted to mention is in talking about open with the community, as you know, Casey, because you covered that story pretty in depth, we're going through our policies. We have a consultant up here helping us go through that. Those policies are going to be public after the new year. You probably heard us paraphrase our policies in different ways in the last year or so as some of these shootings have been discussed in the community. We're just going to go ahead and publish our policies. We have always kept those under tight control. We're not doing that anymore. So the public will be able to see our policies as of next year. So that's just another example of how we're trying to continue this dialogue and make more of what we do, make what we do less mysterious to the public. On the comparison thing, another thing to remember is, well, here's the value of the comparison. It's not so much, as Troy said, as Dr. Payne said, you got multiple jurisdictions, so a multiple jurisdiction site of a similar population to us might appear to have fewer shootings because the county or the neighboring agency or the state did it for them. So you have to factor that out. But if we all had the same data, and so that's dangerous. But if we had the same data and we looked at a trend, like the vehicle trend, we could look at everybody else's data and say, well, that city has a vehicle problem too. Let's get a hold of that city, see what they're doing about it, what's worked for them. So in terms of coming up with information like that, what are the changing trends in criminal behavior? What are the changing tactics that are being adopted by different departments to counter those things? Are you having a problem that only you are having, or is it seen elsewhere around the country? It would be very helpful for that. And then Heather, I'm sorry, what was the question?
I was just wondering, if you're saying that a lot of these cities don't do studies like this, why wasn't it important for you to have, work with UAA to crunch the numbers just to figure this out?
I think I can tell you the mid-sized chiefs want something like this, and they've been debating it since before I joined up with them about a year ago. So I know they're highly interested in having something just like this. They just haven't. It's hard to get a committee to agree on what it's going to look like. Why did I have the university do this? They're researchers. We are not. So there's two reasons, I guess, and that's the first one. We're cops. We're not statisticians. We're not researchers. We'd be messing around in a line of work that we're not good at. We probably would draw incorrect conclusions and forget to look at a right data element or something like that. Second, I wanted an independent look. I wanted to be able to look at the city and say, this isn't me reporting on myself. This is not us reporting on ourselves. We wanted to have some academic source, some outside agency come in. We gave them unredacted police reports, put them in a room, gave them some interns from another department, not APD interns, let them at it, and this is what came out. And I want to be able to say that we were willing to do that.
Did the city pay for it?
Yes.
How much was it?
$8,000 and change. About $8,000.
Technical question. I know that there were five shootings in 2012, and you only went until May, so there were four. But there was another one. Was it 5 and 5? Is that right? Or
As of today, we're 5 and 5.
for 2012 and 2013?
Correct.
And
That last one is not included.
but that last one is not
It
included.
had not been fully investigated at the time we started data collection.
Yeah, if the university was doing a study now, there would be 46 in the study, not 45.
Is there, maybe you mentioned, sorry, so sorry if you did, but was there a trend that you saw over this 20 years?
Not really. And so the numbers are broken out by year in the full report, and it's sort of all over the place, which is what we would expect with a rare phenomenon. So when you're talking about something that occurs between 0 times and 5 times per year, there's going to be some fluctuation in that, and there's just not enough variability to have consistent trends. This, again, is good. I'm very happy that the Anchorage Police Department engages in so few of these incidents. It's good for them, good for the community. But as a data analyst, as a social scientist, I prefer to have a lot more data. So that's one of the reasons that it'll be very interesting to look at the broader use of force data that the department is going to start collecting here very soon. And so over the next couple of years, we expect to be able to partner with the police department and give a more detailed look at use of force incidents beyond just these shootings and be able to talk about them in a much broader way. Does that address your question?
Yeah, because the other thing I was going to ask you, even if you had seen a trend with Anchorage's population obviously increased in 20 years, would that mean anything with that?
You know, it might. You can standardize it by population. Even so, the numbers are, you know, in 2000 it was 4, in 2004 it was 4, and so it just sort of bounces all over the place. Again, something that you would expect with time series data, relatively rare events.
You looked at 45 officer-involved shootings. Did you look at how many of those were fatal or take that into consideration anywhere?
Yes. So that's included in the full report. There's injuries to citizens and also injuries to officers. Injuries to officers were relatively rare, so we've got figures reading the full report. Injuries to citizens were split roughly evenly between fatal gunshot wounds, non-fatal gunshot wounds, bruises, lacerations, contusions, no injury. So about a third of citizens involved in these incidents were fatally shot.
Could I clarify?
Yep.
I just wanted to clarify something. Going forward, when I say we're going to be tracking use of force now and have numbers, that's not to say we don't look at those things now, but it's cumbersome, it's in paper, and we can't easily search the database and recover stuff that happened historically. Every use of force gets evaluated at the APD. It is entered into a database and tracked in an easy way, so I can go back and get a whole bunch of data for a researcher to do. So I didn't mean to imply that we weren't looking at that. I didn't want you to take it that way. But what I want you to know is we're continuing to look at use of force, all use of force in the future, but we're able to track the data and sort the data in a better way.
Yeah, and I can extend on that too. So there are questions about, you know, do other agencies and other cities do this, and the reason that the answer to that question is often no is that police agencies and also courts and also correctional agencies, their primary interest is what happened in this incident. So, you know, for the police department, did a crime occur? Do we know who did it? Can we find them? And can we build a case around that? Can we build a criminal case around that? And so their primary job is doing that. Their primary job is not doing what I do, which is looking at these as a group. So it's taken a long time for criminal justice agencies in general to start to realize the value of looking at this, of looking at trends over time. And it's really only been, you know, in the last 20 years or so that agencies have started to do that, as information systems have made it easier for agencies to do that. It's still a relatively rare thing because their primary job is, you know, did this person commit a crime? If so, which one? How do we investigate that?
Chief, when we talk about these, you know, tracking use of force, I mean, what does that entail exactly? Is that everything from an officer just drawing his weapon to actually, you know, deploying pepper spray or things like that?
Everything above simple handcuffing. So if the officer just handcuffs, compliant handcuffing, and the person doesn't resist, then that doesn't have to get tracked. But if you got to fight him in the handcuffs, if you've got to wrestle with him, if you have to spray him with OC, if you have to strike him either with your open hands, your closed hands, or with a baton, if you have to use a taser, if you have to shoot him with a 40 millimeter, throw a flashbang, noise flash diversionary device, any of that, shoot it, or draw your weapon and order them into compliance, or take deadly force. All of those things are tracked by those different categories, and I might have left one out. The one that I think that will probably be of interest to a researcher would be when we have drawn our weapons and we're issuing commands. That doesn't, I don't want to get in the weeds too much, but you know, if you drew your weapon because you're searching a warehouse, you don't have a target, you're not issuing commands, that we're not tracking. But if it's you and me, Casey, and I'm trying to get control of you and I've drawn down on you, then we're checking that box. So if you took those, it wouldn't be perfect methodology, but if you took all those, you'd have a pretty good idea. These are the times when it could have been better. And maybe it wouldn't be 100%, but I bet you it'd capture, you know, 95% of them. And if you had that same 95% over time, I think that data might be useful.
I have a question over here. What can either of you tell us about the map? I'm not sure if you covered that, if you did, I apologize for bringing it up again. There seems to be maybe a 3 to 4 to 1 ratio versus north of Tudor to south of Tudor.
That's exactly what the report finds. I think Dr. Payne discusses that in the report. And I think he shows you two maps, the first 10 years and the second 10 years, and this one he's combined the two of them. I'll let him work on that.
Yeah, so in the full report, it's split out by decade, because on a 8.5 by 11 size piece of paper, you can't really fit everything and be able to know what you're talking about. This has every shooting incident that was in the data along with the date. And the difficult thing when you're looking at geographic patterns over such a long time period is that you can start to see things that aren't really there. So if you have a shooting that occurs at a location and then 10 years later a shooting occurs a few blocks away, are those two shootings really related? So it can be a little bit difficult, but you're absolutely right that the general trend is north of Tudor, and other than that, the map and the dates sort of speak for itself.
What do the colors mean?
The different colors are just different years to make it easier to differentiate which year the shooting occurred in. So it doesn't look like there's a cluster of things that all happen at the same time.
Good. Any more questions? Good.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.